Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura,
And I'm Tom.
and this is episode number 33.
We have an announcement. By the time you hear this, when this comes out, we are now officially on YouTube. Our entire audio podcast is now available on YouTube. You can go to our YouTube channel at the Tell Me About Podcast, and you can listen to every episode on YouTube. We're also working on getting the audio uploaded to YouTube podcast as well. So look out for that in the next coming days and weeks.
So, today we're talking about the worst maritime disaster in history, the Wilhelm Gustloff. Now, some people think that it's the Titanic or Lusitania that are the worst disasters with the highest death counts, as the Gustloff has been largely forgotten by history. And there are several reasons for that we're going to get into later. So, Tom, have you ever heard of this ship?
This is the first I've ever heard of this.
Well, buckle up because we're going to take a bit of a ride here. So, I do want to give a warning. This story is a bit horrific on all sides. So, if that's not your thing, it's fine to skip this one, but I really do think that it's an important story that needs to be told, especially more often. Are you ready to get into it?
Let's deep dive.
Our story begins in Germany in the mid 1930s as Hitler and the Nazi Party were on the rise and poisoning the culture of the country with their propaganda. In an effort to promote national unity, they pushed what they called the Strength Through Joy movement, which subsidized leisure activities for Germans who otherwise couldn't afford them. The movement aimed to present a more acceptable view of the Third Reich and to make up for low wage growth and the loss of trade union rights. So they were kind of just throwing a vacation at them instead of giving them raises and more rights as laborers.
Well, I mean, isn't that the whole thing about, yeah, they might be fascist, but they make the trains run on time.
In 1936, Hitler ordered the construction of a luxury cruise ship for the German Labor Front, a flagship that was initially intended to be named after him. It was later changed to be named after Wilhelm Gustloff, the leader of the Swiss branch of the Nazi Party who was shot and killed by a Jewish medical student. He saw it as a perfect opportunity to make Gustloff a martyr for the cause and to keep his name in the minds of Germans. The ship was completed in 1938 and was touted as a shining example of Germany's technological superiority and innovation. It was very much state of the art for the time, offering a swimming pool, multiple theaters, and libraries. All the rooms were of the same size and quality, as there was no class structure in Germany at the time. The Gustloff was the largest cruise ship in the world in the late 1930s, holding about 2,000 people at maximum capacity. Now, in comparison, it was about 200 feet smaller than the Titanic, so this wasn't a massive ship, but for the time, it was the largest cruise ship.
It was still a big boy. Let's put it that way.
It was still big, yeah.
And I don't know why. For some reason, I'd been picturing this was a warship. I didn't realize it was a luxury liner.
At first, yeah. It becomes involved in the war, but not in the way you think.
It becomes involved in the war the same way like this friggin' Zeppelins get involved in the war.
Yeah. Germans were offered subsidized cruises for about a quarter of the price of other cruises, though they had to be handpicked by the government in order to get a ticket. It quickly became popular among German laborers, but its life as a luxurious cruise liner would be short lived, only taking about 60 voyages in total. Now, on its fourth voyage, the Gustloff became an unexpected hero when it rescued 19 crewmen from the English coal ship Pegaway, which was fatally damaged in a heavy storm. The rescue played really well in the media and was later used in German propaganda campaigns. In April of 1938, the Gustloff was used as a polling place for Germans and Austrians to vote in England for the annexation of Austria. A year later, it would also be used to bring back soldiers to Germany after the Spanish Civil War ended. As World War II broke out, The Gustloff then became a hospital ship stationed in the Baltic Sea in late 1939. It was painted white with a green stripe and a red cross and served for about a year as a hospital ship for wounded German soldiers.
One thing that's already pretty clear, everything the German ruling party of the 30s and the 40s did, everything was all for show. So already you can kind of see markings of that here. I mean, I know I'm not saying it. I'm not seeing anything overly earth-shattering, because everything that they did, just like everything the Soviets did in the 60s, just like everything the ruling party of Italy did in the 40s, was all a show of military and governmental might and power and force and strength and wealth. I mean, that's kind of wild to think about how often they were able to use this ship basically to propagate the propaganda, so to speak, of whatever they needed to use it for at the time, whether it was to gain favor with the working class, whether it was to support the war effort. It's wild to see German propaganda really in full power, I guess.
And it's interesting you say that because one of the documentaries theorized that Hitler never intended for this to be a cruise liner long term. Like it was to kind of like pacify the citizens for a time. And then he knew if war broke out that he was going to use this in a different way. So that was a theory. We don't know if that's actually true, but that is something that did come up.
Well, it would make sense because everything they did was to serve whatever purpose they needed to serve at that exact moment. Everything was done to project whatever they wanted to project to show solidarity and strength, regardless of whether or not. I mean, I think we can all agree that Germany in the 30s and 40s was bad, but you have to look at it through the lens of everything was made for a specific purpose, not just one, but whatever purpose they needed it for at that time.
By late 1940, it was repainted gray and had all of the medical equipment removed, as it then became a floating barracks for a submarine training division in Poland. So, yet another function. And that's where it sat for the next 4 years. Fast forward to early 1945, the German army was in full retreat in Poland from the advancing Russian Red Army. German civilians and other refugees were being brutally assaulted and killed as a part of the Soviet revenge tour. They didn't discriminate between German soldiers and civilians or other refugees. Everybody was fair game. The Soviets advanced to the point where all roads and railways were blocked, and the only way out of Poland was by ship via the Baltic Sea. The German military launched what would be the largest evacuation in history, dubbed Operation Hannibal, and it was also known as the German Dunkirk, but it was on a much larger scale. 800 ships would evacuate 2 million people from Poland to Germany. Not all evacuees were of German descent. There were refugees from Prussia, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, and Croatia. One of these 800 ships enlisted to help with the evacuation effort was the Wilhelm Gustloff. There was some concern about the condition of the ship's engine, as it had been sitting idle for years, but it was a large ship that was desperately needed. As the Gustloff was being prepped at port, tens of thousands of refugees swarmed to the docks trying to get out of Poland safely. The German military initially tried to sell tickets aboard the Gustloff, but there were so many refugees that they just couldn't keep up. The dock was so chaotic and unruly that the crew of the Gustloff had to move the ship away from port and then transport people by boat to the ship. U-boat crews and wounded soldiers were given first priority, followed by active German military members, and then women and children. Others had to wait for other ships to take them to safety, and they described this like despair that was felt as the Gustloff pulled away from port.
Well, it's self-preservation. We're talking about 1945 at this point. So this is post the complete boondoggle that was the march into what is now Russia, into the Soviet Union. It's the blunder of military blunders at that time. And so now you're kind of left in this complete scramble mode, and kind of all the inadequacies of the German machine at this point are kind of laid bare to rest in this scramble where military are given preferential treatment over refugees.
I thought that was really sad. Like, especially over children. Like, come on.
I mean, well, listen, this is how they operated.
The ship departed the Poland city of Gdynia around 12 p.m. on January 30th, 1945, on its way to the German city of Kiel, which they would reach the next day. The Gustloff was carrying about 10,000 people, including 4,000 children, which was 5 times its normal passenger capacity, though the actual passenger count is uncertain. As they departed Poland, the ship sat lower in the water than normal due to the sheer volume of people aboard. Among the estimated 10,000 passengers were 4 captains. The lead captain was Frederick Peterson, a 63-year-old who had not captained a ship in many years, nor had he captained a ship as large as the Gustloff. Tensions quickly built between him and the other captains aboard the ship, which caused Peterson to become defensive. One of the arguments between the captains was over which route they should take to get back to Germany. Now, there were 2 routes that the Gustloff could have taken that day. They could sail close to the coast where it was too shallow to encounter enemy submarines, but they risked encountering naval mines. Or, conversely, they could travel in the shipping lanes, which were cleared of mines, but they risked encountering the enemy submarines. Captain Peterson made the decision to sail through the shipping lanes, a decision that would end up costing thousands of lives. As they departed, weather conditions quickly deteriorated, with a dense fog and snow setting in. Because of the weather conditions, one of the other captains ordered everybody off the ship decks and to wear their life vests at all times, though a lot of people didn't listen to the second order. In some parts of the ship, it was literally standing room only, and everyone wearing their life jackets would have been next to impossible. Like, there just wasn't room for it,
They were packed in like sardines.
essentially. The pool had been drained to make room for passengers, and the cabins were stuffed with as many as could fit inside. The Gustloff even took on another 600 passengers from another ship early in its voyage. There was no food available and everyone was exhausted, but the relief of escaping the brutality of war overshadowed these less than ideal conditions. That relief would be short-lived, though. Mothers were clutching their children while others were playing cards. The captain transmitted a live, desperate-sounding speech to the Germans from Hitler, which would turn out to be one of his last. The feeling during the speech was allegedly mixed, with some finding comfort in the familiar and others seeing the writing on the wall that the war would be ending soon and what that may mean for them.
Well, I'd have to think by that point, there's a lot of people that are disillusioned at the very least, if not feeling completely bamboozled. To say nothing of, obviously, the abject horrors that he presided over and led. I think you probably had a lot of rank and file Germans who I think maybe at this point on that ship were probably realizing the severity of what they had supported and what they had done.
And a lot of these German civilians, like, they had been brainwashed for years. So the events that had taken place up until this point that night, like, it was so much that they were able to be kind of like rattled out of that a bit. You know what I mean?
Again, it had to feel like you're waking up out of something. Brainwash might be an understatement, to be quite frank, to what this was. I mean, this was brain soaking almost. I mean, this is, he got a whole bunch of people to basically support him in a genocide. Literally. I shouldn't say basically, literally supporting a genocide. And yeah, there, even to this day, there were the very last ones that got brought up on charges in The Hague that were, proud of what they did. But I think a lot of people, I guess my hope in humanity would be a lot of people at this point started to realize what they had supported and what they were doing. And that's something that I think they all had to live with the rest of their lives.
The Gustloff was being accompanied by several other boats, as was a common practice for a civilian ship. A few hours in, however, these boats encountered issues of their own and the Gustloff continued on alone. The crew was notified that there were several German minesweeper ships heading toward them, and Captain Peterson was concerned that he wouldn't see them due to the dense fog. Despite the objections from the other captains, Peterson made the fateful decision to turn on their red and green navigation lights. It said that he was very frustrated at this point, and because he felt challenged by the other captains, he wanted to show his authority. Coincidentally, about 2 weeks earlier, a Soviet submarine captain found himself with just as much to prove. Alexander Marinesko was in his early 30s and had some issues of his own. He was scheduled to captain the S-13 Soviet sub on a mission in the Baltic Sea with the instruction to sink any German boat. His and 3 other subs were to depart shortly after New Year's, but on the scheduled day of departure, Marinesko was nowhere to be found. He had gone on a 3-day bender after the New Year's holiday and allegedly had spent some time at a brothel. After he turned up, his commanders were not happy, and he was facing a court-martial when he and his crew departed on their mission on January 11th. Fast forward back to the night of January 30th, Marinesko and the S-13 crew were lying in wait when they spotted something in the distance. It was the navigation lights of the Wilhelm Gustloff. With the fog, they should have been well hidden from Soviet subs, but the lights made them very easy to spot. Marinesko immediately jumped into action. This was his moment, and he was going to get it. While the S-13 worked to catch up with the Wilhelm, Peterson ordered the navigation lights turned off again, but it was too late. At 9:16 p.m., Marinesko ordered 4 torpedoes to be fired directly at the Gustloff. 3 of them were fired, and the 4th one got jammed. All 3 of them made contact with the port side of the Gustloff and detonated. The first one hit the front of the ship and instantly killed some essential crewmen in their cabins. The second hit midship, where the drained pool and passenger cabins were located. And the third one hit a little bit further back and detonated in the engine room, which cut the lights and electricity immediately. At first, the passengers thought that they just hit a mine and that the ship would make it back to shore. It quickly set in that the Gustloff was catastrophically hit and chaos ensued within the ship. The stairways were bottlenecked with people trying to get up to the decks. Many never made it or got trampled to death in the panic. A crewman was giving instructions over the loudspeaker, but it was drowned out by screaming passengers. Some of those who did make it to the decks fell or jumped into the 39-degree water. Most didn't survive in the water very long. And those temperatures are very similar to the night the Titanic sunk, so this was very cold.
I mean, you're talking about the Baltic Sea in the middle of January. So, I mean, you can do the math on on how cold that water was.
The Gustloff started listing heavily to port almost immediately, which made access to half of the lifeboats on the starboard side impossible. The lifeboats on the port side were frozen to their davits, which made them much more difficult to free. In addition, the crewmen who knew how to properly release the lifeboats were trapped in the hull. Crew and passengers resorting to cutting the lifeboats free with knives while being lowered, but in at least one instance, the rope was cut too soon on one side and not the other, resulting in the boat of passengers being dumped into the Baltic Sea. By 9:45 p.m., several other German minesweeper ships in the area arrived to help rescue passengers. Some were able to swim directly to the other boats, and other passengers were pulled out of the water. Around the same time, the S-13 sub surfaced nearby as the crew feverishly tried to dislodge the jammed 4th torpedo before it could detonate. Crews on the German rescue boats spotted them and began to drop what they called depth charges in retaliation for the attack on the Gustloff. The problem was that these explosions under the surface wound up killing hundreds of the Gustloff passengers that were in the water. By 9:55, 40 minutes after being hit, the Gustloff was almost completely laying on its port side. At this point, no one still trapped in the hole would make it out. Some of the passengers still on the Gustloff, realizing that they were running out of options, unalived themselves and their families with firearms of the German military members to spare them from an even more horrific death. Now, one of the documentaries I watched talked about like what this would look like inside the ship and as it was like turning on its side. And they talked about how the stairs would be sideways and like how did like can you imagine like looking, I mean there's no way to get up that. Like it's just I never really thought about that, but like trying to navigate something that's on its side and just not being able to get out, like that's just a thing of nightmares.
It's horrific. The only way you'd be able to do that, I think, physically, is wouldn't you have to like basically climb up like the banister, like almost like monkey bars?
I think it'd still be very difficult to navigate.
Well, yeah, because it's on its side, so you'd be there's nothing to keep you right side up.
Now, there is this story about a 10-year-old boy named Horst Voigt who was on the Gustloff with his mother. He describes how he was able to get up the stairs to the decks when his mom, right behind him, slipped and fell back down. Miraculously, she was able to make it back up to the deck and they both made it into a lifeboat. He talked about how people were trying to jump into their lifeboat as it was being lowered, which like almost capsized them like in the air. And he also allegedly brought his own Swiss Army knife that wound up help cutting the lifeboat free from the ropes. So he is one of the more famous stories to come out of this. He has given several interviews and I don't know if he's still alive today because he was pretty elderly in the last video that I saw of him. But yeah, I think he's probably the most vocal from this disaster that survived and shared the story.
What was probably, and obviously, if you saw it, what was maybe the most one of the most interesting things or one of the most memorable things, I guess, he's always talked about? Is it about trying to get up the stairs?
He paints it very detailed about like what he was seeing and the fear that he lost his mother and like I guess the temporary relief he felt when he saw her get back up on the deck as they're still dealing with this. But I think that that is probably the most I know that it's probably the biggest part of the story that he tends to share.
I mean, that's got to be traumatizing, beyond traumatizing. I mean, put the political everything to the side for a second. That has to be beyond traumatizing just as a human being.
There was also another female survivor, and she was also very young when this happened. And apparently, for the rest of her life, like she couldn't go in water, like she couldn't swim, wouldn't go in a pool or the ocean or a lake or anything. And it's like, I don't blame you after this, you know?
No, I mean it's PTSD. I mean, if that were to happen, I don't think I would probably want to go in the water or do anything on water either.
Only 5 of the 11 lifeboats from the port side were successfully launched as the Gustloff was taking its final plunge. Only an hour after being hit, the Gustloff sunk beneath the surface at 10:18 p.m. The lights reportedly came on again briefly as it went down. Now, Tom, I sent you a video in the chat of the animation of how this sunk. So we will post this on our social media and include it in our YouTube video, but I thought it was a very clear, it shows very clearly how this went down.
Okay, so that's wild. The port side was up in the air.
No,
The starboard side was up in the air.
correct.
Okay. I mean, an hour's not that long. Titanic was what, about an hour and a half?
Titanic was 2 hours and 40 minutes.
I mean, all that happening in an hour is pretty quick.
This was very, like I said, very catastrophic. And with as many people on board, like this, it was a death sentence. Like there was no way out of this for most of them.
Well, and you could see from the animation, I mean, almost immediately after the three impacts, half the boat's in the water on its side already. I mean, so already you have, again, not knowing the complete blueprint of the ship as to how many cabins are on each side of the ship. My guess is you had basically half the ship's already a goner, literally within minutes. They're trapped on that side that's already basically submerged. That's unreal. I've never really seen a ship that size go down like that, or go down in that way where it's sitting on its side like it's a toy in the bath. I'm blown away by how quickly it happened and the way that it happened on its side, because I've never seen that happen before.
It's funny, I mean, I'm definitely a lot more into this than you are, but there's quite a number of ships that land on its side, on either side, depending on what happens. Like the Titanic falling kind of, I guess, sitting upright. That is not typical. I guess gravity and, like I said, where any damage was when it went down, it kind of fills one side of the ship and it just gravity kind of just takes it down to one side or the other. So that is a little more typical to see it on its side.
I probably would agree with that probably too. I just never saw it, or I never really imagined it until I saw the animation of it. But God, it must have been horrible if you were on the port side. I mean, it's almost an instantaneous death sentence.
There's actually a movie that was made about this where obviously they reenacted and recreated this, and kind of like the Titanic movie, just like the bursts of water that are coming through and people are just getting wiped out. It's interesting. Couple of things that I wanted to say to that. The first is a little more lighthearted, that one of the YouTube creators that I watch who is huge into shipwrecks, there's actually this Titanic toy model where if you put it into like a bathtub or floating water, like it will simulate the sinking. Like it'll break apart at one point and like sink to the bottom of your tub or whatever it is. I don't know. It's kind of weird to recreate that, but like for like huge nerds that like to do that, like I think for a kid too, like that was, he said it was really cool.
I listen, kids have a lot of different toys today than we used to. I don't remember, we had like, no, what was it, the Rock and Sock'em robots where the head would pop off in the boxing ring. I remember seeing a mini Lego Titanic that would snap in half when you put it in a tub.
It is kind of cool to watch it though. Like I saw him do a demonstration of it and it is kind of neat.
My guess is it's one of these models where it's like you can put it back together,
Yes.
because it's not like a ship in the bottle type of thing. I'm sure it's fun to see. It's just I wouldn't imagine playing with that when I was like 10.
The second thing that I wanted to mention, you talked about like the way it sank. And for me, that's one of the most interesting things, like the physics of it. And I can get real nerdy about this stuff. But even with the Titanic, we don't 100% know the physics of how it happens. Like the animation that you saw is the best guess that we have on how this sank, because nobody was taking pictures of it. Nobody has video of it like up close. Like the survivors can only provide so much eyewitness testimony, and you know how sometimes that can be conflicting and people remember different things or see different things and such. But I don't know, it's always crazy to me. And James Cameron actually did this thing on History Channel about like, and he really went in depth with the physics about the Titanic breaking up, and it's just so fascinating because these things are built to stay afloat, and it's like what sinks them, how quickly, in what direction, like it's all crazy.
I mean, even just a millimeter another way sinks it a completely different way. Because I'm sure it has everything to do with the angle of the gash and the direction that the water's rushing in.
And then there's a factor of like kind of with the Fitzgerald that we talked about, where I think at a certain point the crew was trying to get the water out that was coming in and they were just barely able to keep up with it. So it's like that's something else you have to contend with, like how much the water is pouring in, how fast and where on the ship.
You don't realize how fast water moves and how much water is out there until a situation like that occurs. knock on wood, thank God I've never had to experience that. But I can tell you, even from just doing something like a whitewater rapids one time, you don't understand until you actually see water in a tight space. You don't understand how fast it moves and how quickly and insidiously it builds up.
And I think I mentioned this on either our Titanic or Fitzgerald episodes that water is extremely heavy. And especially in these ships, once it gets in, like you're done.
Well, and even, with the ship, not even with the ships. I mean, even think of like Hurricane Katrina. When the levees failed, it wasn't the storm that flooded New Orleans per se. It was the levees failing and the levees breaking. That's what flooded New Orleans. But it wasn't necessarily just because the hurricane dropped a lot of water on parts of New Orleans. It was that and the storm surge that pushed the levees beyond their breaking point and they snapped. It's one thing, I think it was, what was it, last week or 2 weeks ago or something? There was the video about the dam that was either breaking or about to break in Minnesota because of the floods or something like that. And you don't think there's a lot of water there, and then all of a sudden there is. That's what I mean about the insidious. And I know we're talking about, I'm going in like 18 different directions here, but my larger point is you don't realize how heavy it is and how much of it is there until a situation like that occurs. And then once it starts, it is almost impossible to keep up with it. You're literally at that point treading water.
Marinesco watched the Gustloff's last moments from a distance as his crew disabled the fourth torpedo and began to run to escape being hit by a depth charge. He was reportedly very proud of himself. There is no accurate count on the death toll, but it is estimated that 9,400 people lost their lives in the disaster, making it the largest single ship disaster in maritime history. Now, I did see some conflicting information about some of the lifeboats either being left behind or that all the occupants had frozen in the lifeboat before being rescued. And I don't know how much of either is true, but what I gather is that even if you made it to a lifeboat, that didn't necessarily meant that you made it.
So that toll would include the lifeboats as well as whoever as the actual ship.
Yes, and there were a lot of bodies in the water.
Well, I would, yeah, from hypothermia or the depth charges.
For weeks, frozen bodies washed up on the shore, and recovered bodies were placed in mass graves. Family members talk about not even knowing where their loved one is buried, let alone having a proper individual memorial to them. When the news of the sinking got back to Hitler, he tried to keep it a secret from the German people, as the enormous loss of life didn't look good for him, especially because it was a result of a war that he started. A Swedish newspaper reported the story, and word slowly got back to the German citizens. An inquiry was started by the Germans, but it went nowhere because the Third Reich was crumbling as World War II was coming to an end. The Soviets were accused by some of war crimes in the sinking of the Gustloff, especially because of the sheer number of civilian lives lost, including 3,000 to 4,000 children. The Soviets were never formally charged with a war crime and argue that the Gustloff had no markings indicating that it was a civilian or hospital ship, so it was, quote, fair game. Captain Peterson somehow survived the sinking but died shortly after the war. Now, I couldn't find much information about this, like how he survived, what happened, and I'm sure you know that most captains go down with the ship as they're supposed to be the last ones off the ship, and if they're not, then you're going down with it. Except the captain of the Costa Concordia, which is a story I will get into in the future at some point. You are going to hate that captain, but that's another story for another day.
Or what was the Italian guy?
That was him.
That
It
was
was
him.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
him. Yeah, a real you know.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean that's the whole point of being the captain. you're supposed to take care of everyone else before you're supposed to put everyone else in front of yourself. That's the whole responsibility when you are named captain of a ship or just captain of anything. That being said, I get back to, I made the joke about, yeah, they're fascists, but they make the trains run on time. They kept, the trains ran on time under their watch. I mean, this was such a needless kind of display of German hubris, of just hubris in general. First of all, how do you not, maybe if you had made it a pure refugee ship and not tried to squeeze as many military officers as you could in there, you could have marked it as a refugee ship. And then it would be fair game. Now, I guess the flip side is in the fog and underwater, how would you necessarily know that? Especially when it seemed like even with the lights on, you were kind of shooting blind to an extent.
There's a lot of discussion back and forth whether the Soviets knew. And a lot of people think that they knew. It was mostly civilians. I don't know. We weren't in their heads at the time, but from accounts of this tragedy, people tend to think that they knew.
I mean, at the same time, though, how do you prove that, though?
Yeah, exactly.
I get back to when I say about hubris, you have one captain out of 4 on this ship who basically decides he's going to make it a giant what measuring contest to prove his worth, and then saves himself at the expense of almost everyone else.
And I wondered that as I was writing this, like, if one of the other 3 captains were in charge. I don't think, obviously, the ship was done. Like, there was no saving the ship. But I wonder if he could have saved any more lives. I wonder if one of them would have gone down with the ship. You just don't know. I don't know what happened to the other 3 either.
No, and again, when it comes down to it's so much of what Germany did, again, putting aside the obvious atrocities, so much of what they did was a show of might and a show of force. And this is kind of that on a micro scale. You have 4 captains that can't even get to a consensus on whether or not on who's doing what. And so what you have is just basically a vacuum of any sort of direction other than just making a massive show of everything. And so lacking at any actual direction, you're left with just chaos. And that's what happened here, because you have a captain again who decides to stroke his ego, for lack of a better term. And now, of course, on the Soviet side, you have that too, which I think kind of just compounds everything. It's not hard to see from this how so many things that Germany was concerned themselves with at this time failed, because there was so much focus on having it be big and bold and having it basically making a show of force that no one stopped to think about the actual logistics of it. Not to make a joke of it, but it's like Michael Bolton. I always forget some minute detail. Well, putting the lights on to where other submarines can see you is not minute, Michael or Frederick.
And it does remind me a lot of the Titanic in that there were a lot of little things that went wrong. There were a lot of little decisions that added up to disaster. Like, if they would have gone in shallow waters hugging the coast, this probably wouldn't have happened, you know? So if they kept their lights off, like you said, may not have happened. They probably wouldn't have seen them. So it's just a lot of little, like you said, also the power struggle among the leadership on this ship. It's just, it was a lot of things.
Now, this might be too far into the weeds, but did they say, for example, would the damage from from a mine in the shallower waters hugging the coast? You mentioned that passengers thought it was just a mine. Even if they had hit a couple of those, would that have had the same type of damage as the torpedoes?
That's a good question. I think, as we said before, about like the logistics and the physics of a sinking ship. I think it would depend on where it was hit and how bad. But I think the caveat with being closer to the coast is it would be easier to get people out of the water, you would think, than being in this deeper water in the shipping lanes.
Well, in shallower water, you would think.
Yes.
I mean, maybe at that point, whatever damage you get from, and maybe that's a question that someone can answer, is whether the damage of a mine would have been lesser or greater than what the torpedoes did. And then the other thing too, I want to get back to, because again, whether it was Germany, whether it was Italy, whether it was Japan, name whatever autocratic, fascist, dictatorship you can think of, they're always concerned about the infrastructure, right? The infrastructure, the infrastructure. Yet this was a boat that was sitting there for years over capacity. It just, to me, again, it speaks to how for show everything with Germany was. Again, I can't stress this enough. That the atrocities that Germany committed during this time are graphic and horrific. It is mind-blowing to think about how inept they were in a lot of ways when it came to just kind of minute things that autocrats love to brag about, if that makes any sense.
I do agree with you, and I understand where you're coming from. And I think that would reflect more earlier in the war, because I think by this point, the Germans were so desperate and they were being outgunned, they were being outfought, like it was coming to an end. So I think at least in this situation, it was very much desperate. Let's do everything we can.
Oh, and I'm not debating that by that I mean, they know by this point that the higher ups know they can see the future here. So this is all about, to an extent, self-preservation. And
Yeah.
it's self-preservation of them alone, not necessarily even the refugees. I mean, it's their own self-preservation above all else at this point. Again, it's kind of one of those ironies that a state that so much founded itself on infrastructure crumbled, had this tragedy happen in part because of it.
So Marinesco and the crew of the S-13 went on to take down a German hospital ship of wounded soldiers in the weeks after the Gustloff sinking, killing another 4,000 people. To make it even more heartbreaking, the rescue effort of that ship was intentionally unremarkable because the soldiers' injuries made it difficult for them to make it out alive. So they assumed that they couldn't rescue them, so they didn't really try to. And it's like these were their own soldiers that were wounded in a war for their cause. And you can't even, it makes me very upset. You can't even make the effort to try to save as many of them as you can.
So much of what they did was basically a show of force for the outside world. I mean, look at the whole Zeppelin project. I mean, no one really stopped to think about, hey, what happens if this catches fire? And one of my favorite podcasts joked and said, basically, could you have stopped this if just someone had gone up on a rooftop in London with a big needle? Could they have stopped the Zeppelins? I can't help but think about how many civilians on that ship in those last moments had to be thinking about how their government betrayed them. Really, in a lot of ways, sold them a bill of goods on something and then sold them down the river to save themselves. I'm sure you had a lot of people. I mean, all throughout history, we have despots and horrible leaders who do commit atrocities. Have people that really believe in the cause, but so many of them just get swept up in it. And I can't stop thinking about how many of them maybe finally woke up at that moment. It was a moment of clarity before the end.
After the war, Marinesco never got the recognition that he wanted and was dishonorably discharged from the Navy in 1945. Because of his extracurricular activities, the Soviets didn't think that he made a proper hero. Years later, He reportedly served time in prison for helping a friend steal bricks from a construction site. So I thought that was a little odd, but
I mean, that kind of sums up the whole geopolitical temperature, so to speak, of the time, that the Soviets didn't want him as a hero because it made them look bad too.
Marinesco died in 1963 of cancer at the age of 50. In 1990, President Gorbachev posthumously honored him with a Hero of the Soviet Union award for his actions in World War II. The wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff lays in relatively shallow water, about 150 feet down on the floor of the Baltic Sea. For comparison, the Titanic is 12,500 feet down in the Atlantic. So this wasn't missing. There was no searching for the wreck like they did the Titanic. Like they knew where this was from day one. It was about 20 miles offshore from Poland. And almost immediately, Soviet looters were taking valuables and destroying parts of the ship. Today, the wreck is classified as a war grave and is one of the largest shipwrecks at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. The Polish Maritime Office now forbids diving within a 1,600-foot radius of the wreck to prevent any further disruption of the site. One documentary that I watched showed this dive team exploring the wreck site with permission from the Polish Maritime Office. And as we've talked, the wreck is laying on its port side, and the midship is now just completely collapsed in on itself. And the dive team, their mission was to kind of like go down and try to see the damage that was done to the ship and if they could learn anything from that. But they couldn't get safely into the ship to get to the other side and explore and investigate like the torpedo damage from the port side because it's laying on that side. So they just couldn't get to it. So there was a lot of plans and data that they wanted to get that they just couldn't get. And there's still a lot of unanswered questions about the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff, including an accurate number of lives lost.
How deep were the waters for the first route compared? Because 150 feet's not that deep.
No, I don't know for sure, but obviously more shallow than that.
Yeah.
A lot of the unanswered questions will likely never be answered. So, why is this story largely unknown to the general public? Well, there are reasons. First, both the Germans and Soviets wanted to keep it quiet for their own interests. The Germans wanted to hide the fact that they were losing the war, and the Soviets didn't want to celebrate the loss of civilian and refugee lives, recognizing how it looked, quote, unnecessarily brutal in hindsight. Second, the sinking could be seen as a casualty of war. The Wilhelm Gustloff was one of numerous ships and lives lost during World War II. It was also one of multiple ships that were sunk during Operation Hannibal. The sinking also occurred near the end of the war as the Nazi Party was crumbling, which was the bigger news story. Third, since the end of World War II, German civilians have been hesitant to mourn their own who were lost during this time, acknowledging their own shameful history, or their country's shameful history. They don't want to be seen as victims, given the horrific events that happened leading up to and during the war. And I get this, like I do, and I think that's very respectable and very humble of them, but I think it's okay to mourn the innocent lives that were lost. Like, if you don't want to mourn the German soldiers that were lost here, I understand that. But the innocent children, the 3,000 to 4,000 innocent children that were lost, I think it's okay to mourn them.
Well, in the first part, there's another irony in this, in that just as Germany kind of wanted to brush this aside to kind of hide the fact that they were losing the war, Gorbachev honoring the captain posthumously, as the Soviet Union itself was trying to basically prop itself up, as desperately trying to prop itself up as best it could at this point. I mean, there's kind of a full circle kind of deal there, unfortunately. Listen, I think you ask any German person, they'll tell you that their relationship with their country, I think, is very complex. Germany has very much kind of taken the stance of basically the 1930 up until 1945 kind of just didn't happen. We went from the 1910s all the way to 1947, and just nothing happened in between there. Nothing. So there's a very complicated history about wanting to, and I would agree that there is a very fine line between, I think, memorializing and acknowledging the history so that you can learn from it and not do it again, and also honoring soldiers who may have been war criminals in their own right. So I understand that it's a very fine line to walk, and unless you have a very clear and nuanced way to walk it, it's probably better not to do it. The risk in that is that there are a lot of civilians who are kind of just forgotten to time because of this. That's kind of result when you're kind of left in this extremely nuanced situation where context is absolutely critical to understanding what happened.
And as I kind of mentioned, some people argue that the death of active German military members is justified, or even that like this disaster was a direct result of their leaders' actions and was essentially like a fuck around and find out situation, you know? But to me, like looking at this as an isolated event or in the larger context, like it's horrific all around. And it really went from this ship of hope to like this ship of despair, like within 9 hours. And like you said, it's never been properly honored by history for all the innocent lives that were lost. There are a few books, movies, and documentaries made about the disaster, including the 2008 movie Die Gustloff and the book Salt to the Sea. Now, my main question from all this, and this is something that I really struggled with when I was researching and writing this, and we've touched on this a bit, where does your empathy lie in this situation? Like when I was researching like the actual sinking and just hearing some of these like terrible accounts of what this looked like and what this felt like and all the chaos and fear, like I was really hating the Soviets, like how dare you do this to all these people? But it's like then the Soviets had been through so much and they had been terrorized and brutalized by the Germans. And they obviously did not come from a well intentioned place, to say the least. So I don't know. I really struggled on both sides of this. I don't know how you feel about it.
Well, and that's the thing of war, isn't it? What ends are justified to reach the means, I guess. Listen, if you had told me that the German soldiers there were basically trying to use civilian refugees as a meat shield, that wouldn't surprise me. Like I said, Germany was at that time was so evil, and they were so desperate to try and cling to whatever military might they had left, considering again this was a war that they started. But at what point does the geopolitics of the era be put aside and just someone's humanity comes in? And I honestly don't know. I think the answer is, at least from my perspective, that I think it's a tragedy for everyone involved. And I think that's kind of the way you have to leave it.
Yeah, and I think that's where I guess I finally fall. Like it's just like I said, it's just horrific all the way around. And it didn't, that's the thing, it didn't have to happen. Not just this, but like I said, everybody that lost their lives on either side or any side in World War II, it didn't have to happen.
No, I think that's the takeaway from all of this is that it was a tragedy that was completely avoidable.
So I know we talked about both of the captains, and I don't know, do you think they were both equally terrible? Do you think that they were both just had something to prove and, both don't look great on either side? Like, do you dislike one over the other? What do you think?
Ego's a hell of a thing. And I think this was a clear case of both men's egos getting the best of them. I think one of the things that happens with war is you have a lot of people that rightly or wrongly are willing to fight for a cause. And again, at what point are the ends justified by the means? Is there a point where they're no longer justifiable? Is it all just collateral damage to try and gain a tactical advantage? I mean, I don't know. And I don't think either one of them look great here. In so a lot of ways, both of them kind of end up dying the villain, so to speak. So I really don't think there's one that's worse than the other. I think I think it's just a tragedy in every sense of the word for everyone involved.
I agree that I think they are both problematic in their own ways. And again, like, at least on the Gustloff, if there was a different captain, like, and that's my last question. Like, was there a way to lessen the loss of life here? I don't know because, like you said, this happened so fast. This was so chaotic. Where it was hit and the way it was hit, like, I mean, the depth charges, that I think was stupid. Like, I don't know if that, because they didn't even sink the S-13. Like, I'm not sure. I don't think they hit them, to be honest. They just scared them away. But it's like, but you killed hundreds of these passengers in the water just to do that, just to scare them. So it's like, I guess you didn't want more loss of life. You didn't want more torpedoes launched at you. It's just so, some of these decisions I just question, but in the moment, that's a different story.
And we'll never know. And I think even if both of them were alive today, I don't think either one of them would ever tell you with a straight face. Because I think you had two very headstrong individuals who were driven by their id and their ego. And I don't think either one of them would ever admit that or never kind of face what happened. I mean, I don't think Peterson ever would. I doubt the Soviet captain ever would. So you're kind of just left with this just massive gray area. And I wish I had a better answer for you, but that's really kind of what it is.
So tell us what you guys think. What do you think about this story? Have you heard of this story before? Do you think anything could have been different? Definitely let us know on our socials or our email.
So it's the at Tell Me About podcast on Instagram, TikTok, and on YouTube. And it's the Tell Me About podcast at gmail.com. So please, as always, send us your comments, your thoughts, your suggestions. We really love the interaction, especially on YouTube. We're going to get back to posting clips and episodes from some of the older shows on there as well. So just keep an eye out for that.
So, at least for now, for the rest of the summer, it's just a little bit easier for us to do every other week for episodes. And we're going to get back to weekly, hopefully in the fall. But it's just, we found that it's just a little bit easier to do this with both of us having a lot going on right now. So, we will see you in 2 weeks. Tom will have another episode for us. And as he said, remember to rate, review, and subscribe on our socials. And we will see you in 2 weeks.
And don't worry, folks, we're going to lighten the mood in 2 weeks with just some garden variety fun corporate crimes.
We're back to corporate crimes. At least with the corporate crimes, not as many people die, so there's that.
Yeah, and just a bunch of assholes go to jail.
Yeah, that's a better outcome.
See you in 2 weeks, everybody.
Bye.